An entire civilization vanished from Scotland without a trace. Over 1,000 years ago, the Picts, who built massive fortifications, carved hundreds of mysterious symbol stones, and dominated northern Britain for centuries, simply disappeared. Or did they? Because what I'm about to show you completely rewrites everything you thought you knew about one of Scotland's greatest mysteries. And here's the kicker: you might actually be descended from them. Let's forge the truth. The Picts controlled Scotland from roughly the 3rd to the 9th century CE. That's over 600 years of dominance across the Highlands and eastern coastlands. The Romans couldn't conquer them. The Angles couldn't push them back. They were, by all accounts, a formidable civilization. They left behind over 350 intricately carved symbol stones, a sophisticated communication system we still don't fully understand. They built massive fortified settlements that housed thousands. They traded with continental Europe and accumulated significant wealth. And then, around 900 CE, they just stopped existing. No more carvings, no more records. The Pictish language disappeared. Their culture vanished. This disappearance has baffled historians for centuries and spawned countless theories, from mass genocide to mysterious plagues to supernatural explanations. It's become one of archaeology's greatest unsolved mysteries. But here's the thing about mysteries: sometimes they persist because we're asking the wrong questions. Let's start with what the Picts actually left behind. And trust me, it's not what you'd expect from a civilization that supposedly vanished without a trace. Tartan in Aberdeenshire is one of the largest hill forts in Scotland. Recent excavations revealed over 800 hut platforms, enough to house up to 4,000 people. That's not a village, that's an urban centre, and it dates to the 5th and 6th centuries CE, right in the heart of the Pictish period. Then there's Burghead on the Moray coast. Massive ramparts, dense occupation layers spanning 500 to 1000 CE, and evidence of metalworking, weaponry, and high-status artefacts. This was a fortified power centre that operated for 5 centuries. The material culture is equally impressive. Pictish silver hoards from the 4th to 6th centuries contain Roman silver mixed with uniquely Pictish craftsmanship, intricate brooches, vessels, bracelets. The Gallcross hoard and Norreys Law hoard show pieces bearing Pictish symbols, alongside evidence of Mediterranean trade goods. And here's something fascinating: vitrified fortifications. At sites like Bannockburn and Burghead, intense heat was used to partially melt stone ramparts, creating incredibly strong defensive walls. This required organised labour, advanced engineering knowledge, and centralised power. Those 350 plus symbol stones, they're not random decorations. Recent radiocarbon dating pushes their origins back to the 3rd to 4th century CE, much earlier than previously thought. They represent a sophisticated communication system, possibly recording names, genealogies, or territorial claims. Symbols appear on stones, bones, metal, and cave walls across Pictish territory. So here's my question: does this sound like a primitive society that could just disappear overnight? Because turns out, you can't lose an entire civilization when they're building cities, forging international trade networks, and developing unique writing systems. But here's where this mystery gets really interesting, and where modern science completely changes the game. Because while historians were debating what happened to the Picts based on incomplete records and archaeological fragments, geneticists were quietly extracting DNA from Pictish burial sites, and what they found? It's a bombshell that solves the entire mystery. In 2019, researchers successfully extracted high-quality DNA from Pictish-era cemeteries at London, Lincs and Ballintor, sites dating from the 5th to 7th centuries CE. The results were definitive. The Picts descended from local Iron Age populations who were already present in Britain. They weren't mysterious invaders or a lost tribe. They were indigenous to Scotland, with genetic roots stretching back thousands of years. But here's the crucial finding. Modern populations from Western Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and Northumbria show significant genetic affinity with the Picts. The DNA analysis revealed haplotype sharing, essentially genetic markers passed down through generations. Translation: modern Scots, especially in the West, are directly descended from Picts. They didn't vanish, they're still here. You might be looking at one on your screen. So what actually happened around 900 CE? Political unification, not genocide. Kenneth MacAlpin, who reigned from 843 to 858 CE, united the Scottish kingdom of Dal Riada with the Pictish kingdom. This wasn't a conquest in the traditional sense, it involved both military consolidation and dynastic alliance, possibly through Pictish inheritance customs that allowed succession through the female line. Kenneth moved sacred relics, including the Stone of Scone, to Fort Eviat, establishing it as the capital of the new kingdom of Alba. Alba wasn't a single ethnic group, it was a political entity encompassing both Picts and Gaels. Here's the key: Kenneth bore the title King of the Picts, and his successors were recorded as King of Alba. The Pictish identity didn't disappear, it merged into a broader Scottish identity. The language shifted to Gaelic, the culture assimilated, but the people remained. Archaeological evidence supports this. No mass population displacement, no sudden abandonment of settlements, no evidence of widespread violence or plague. Just gradual cultural transition as two kingdoms became one. So if the Picts didn't vanish, why does everyone think they did? Simple. The Scots who unified with them had written history. When the two cultures merged, the historical narrative became dominated by Gaelic-speaking scribes who recorded events from a Scottish perspective. Pictish oral traditions and their unique symbols system weren't preserved in the same way. The symbol stones stopped being carved around the 10th century, not because the people vanished, but because the culture that created them had evolved into something new. It's like asking why Americans stopped speaking Elizabethan English. The language changed, but the people didn't disappear. The Viking attack of 839 CE, which killed most of the Pictish royal family, certainly accelerated political change, but it didn't erase the population. It just shifted the power structure that eventually led to Kenneth MacAlpin's unification. The mystery of the vanishing Picts is really just the story of cultural assimilation, something that's happened countless times throughout history when neighbouring people unite under a single political entity. So here's the verdict. Fiction. The Picts didn't vanish. They evolved. The evidence is overwhelming. 1. Archaeological sites show continuous occupation with no sudden abandonment. Tapple North, Burghead, Rinnie, these weren't ghost towns. They show gradual cultural transition, not catastrophic disappearance. 2. DNA analysis proves genetic continuity. The Picts' descendants are modern Scots, Welsh, Irish and Northumbrians. When you walk through Edinburgh or Inverness, you're walking among their descendants. 3. Historical records document political unification in 843 CE, not genocide or mysterious vanishing. Kenneth MacAlpin created the Kingdom of Alba by merging two existing kingdoms, a political evolution, not a population extinction. The Picts didn't disappear, their identity was absorbed into the emerging Scottish nation. Their genes, their settlements, their fortifications, their art, it all remained. What changed was the name, the language and the political structure. So the next time someone tells you the Picts mysteriously vanished, you can tell them the truth. They didn't go anywhere. In fact, if you've got Scottish ancestry, there's a very good chance you're descended from them. Turns out, The greatest mystery wasn't where they went, it was why we ever thought they left. Speaking of Scottish victories, there's one battle England really doesn't want you to know about. June 1314. 6,000 Scots faced 20,000 English knights in battle that changed Britain forever. The odds were impossible, the outcome was legendary. But was Bannockburn really the David versus Goliath story we've been told? Or is there something the history books aren't telling you about Scotland's most famous victory? Next time on Fact or Fiction Foundry, we're forging the truth about Bannockburn. And trust me, the reality is even better than the legend. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. I'm digging through the battle records and what I found is going to surprise you. June 24th, 1314. England suffered its most humiliating military defeat of the medieval period. Thousands of their finest knights routed by a smaller Scottish force. So catastrophic that it changed the course of British history forever. So why don't English schools teach it? Today, we're digging into Bannockburn, where Scottish legend meets English silence. And the truth? It's better than either side wants to admit. If you're Scottish, you know the story. Robert the Bruce, heroic underdog king, facing impossible odds. Outnumbered 10-1 by the mighty English army. Against all logic, Scotland wins. Independence secured. Roll credits. If you're English, you might not have heard of this battle at all. It's barely mentioned in the curriculum. Just a minor setback in the grand sweep of English history, right? Here's the problem. Both narratives are incomplete. The Scottish version oversimplifies a complex military and political situation. The English version conveniently forgets one of their worst strategic disasters. So what actually happened? Let's melt down the myths and forge the facts. First, those troop numbers. Scottish legend loves the David versus Goliath angle. One Scot for every 10 Englishmen. Dramatic, but not accurate. Actual numbers? 6,000 to 9,000 Scots versus 15,000 to 20,000 English. Still outnumbered? Yes. 2-1, maybe 3-1, but not the impossible odds you've heard about. Now here's where it gets interesting. Robert the Bruce didn't win through luck or divine intervention. He won through tactical genius. His secret weapon? The Shiltron, a defensive pike square that turned Scottish infantry into mobile fortresses. English cavalry charges? Useless. Those 12-foot pikes created an impenetrable wall. Horses won't charge into a hedge of spears. It's basic animal psychology. But Bruce had another advantage the legends don't emphasise enough. Terrain. The English army was forced onto marshy ground near the Bannockburn stream. Heavy cavalry in a swamp, armoured knights sinking into mud. It's like bringing a Ferrari to a bog. Impressive on paper, catastrophic in practice. The battle lasted 2 days, June 23rd and 24th. Day 1, English vanguard defeated in skirmishes. Day 2, Bruce committed his full force driving the English into the marshland. Chaos, panic, rout. This wasn't a miracle, it was tactical mastery. But here's what the legends conveniently skip over. Robert the Bruce wasn't the universally beloved hero you've been told about. In fact, many Scots hated him, and for good reason. February 10th, 1306. Robert the Bruce walks into Greyfriars Church in Dumfries and murders John Comyn, his rival for the Scottish throne. Stabs him in front of the altar. The Pope excommunicates him. Scottish nobles from the Comyn and Balliol factions refuse to support him. Some actively fight for England against Bruce. This isn't a united Scotland rallying behind a heroic king, it's a civil war. Bruce spent years fighting other Scots before he could even think about challenging England. Bannockburn wasn't just about independence, it was about legitimising Bruce's contested claim to the throne. Now let's talk about his opponent, Edward II. Edward II was not his father. Edward I, Hammer of the Scots, was a military genius who'd crushed Scottish resistance for years. Edward II, politically weak, militarily inexperienced, facing opposition from his own nobles. Bannockburn wasn't just a Scottish victory, it was an English political disaster that exposed Edward II's incompetence. That's why English historians downplay it. It's embarrassing. The Wars of Scottish Independence didn't start in 1314. They started in 1296 and wouldn't truly end until 1357. Bannockburn was one battle in a 61-year conflict. Now you might be thinking, if Bannockburn was so decisive, why did the war continue for another 14 years? Great question, because Bannockburn didn't secure Scottish independence. What it secured was Robert the Bruce's kingship. After Bannockburn, no Scottish noble could credibly challenge his claim. He'd proven himself militarily and politically. But England? They didn't recognise Scottish independence. Edward II refused to negotiate. The war continued. Raids, sieges, diplomatic standoffs. Scottish forces raided northern England repeatedly. English forces launched counter-invasions. Back and forth for over a decade. It wasn't until March 17, 1328, 14 years after Bannockburn, that the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton was signed. That's when England finally officially recognised Scottish independence. And even then, it was because Edward II had been deposed and murdered, and his son Edward III needed political stability. Bannockburn created the conditions for independence, but it took 14 more years of warfare and diplomacy to actually achieve it. So, fact with crucial context, Bannockburn was a pivotal moment in Scottish history, but not the way the legend tells it. The evidence? Tactical masterpiece, not miraculous underdog story. Bruce exploited terrain, used innovative pike formations, and outmanoeuvred a larger but poorly commanded English force secured Bruce's throne, not immediate independence. English downplay it because it revealed Edward II's incompetence. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a political humiliation that exposed the weakness of English leadership. The real story is better than the myth. Bannockburn wasn't about destiny or divine favour. It was about a contested king who turned tactical brilliance and political ruthlessness into legitimacy. A battle that didn't end a war, but changed who was winning it. Scotland didn't win independence on June the 24th, 1314, but Robert the Bruce won the right to fight for it. But here's a question the legends never answer. Who actually fought at Bannockburn? Which clan stood with Bruce? Which fought against him? The answer might surprise you, because the clans you think were there probably weren't. That's next time on Fact or Fiction Foundry. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. What if I told you most Scottish clan traditions are only about 200 years old? I know, sacrilege. We've been sold a story of ancient bloodkin, sacred tartans and timeless rituals. But pull the thread and the pattern that appears is Victorian. By the end of this video, you'll see clan tradition very differently, and you'll still have plenty to be proud of. Here's the romantic version. Clans were giant families where everyone was blood related. Each clan had its own tartan going back centuries. The Highlands were a mosaic of ancient tribes in constant feud. and somehow that structure survived intact to today. It's everywhere. Films, series, tourist brochures, airport shops, modern clan societies. It feels good because identity and belonging matter. But what feels ancient and what is ancient are not always the same thing. Rewind to the early 1800s. Sir Walter Scott writes wildly popular romances and in 1822 stage manages King George VI's Edinburgh visit like a national costume party. Kilts and tartans become a theatrical shorthand for Scottishness. That pageantry, what we now call traditional, gets supercharged right there. Then the Crown makes it fashionable. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert fall in love with the Highlands, take Balmoral and wrap court life in tartan in the 1840s and 50s. When the royals wear something, the empire notices. Meanwhile, tartan starts getting systematised. Weavers, collectors and societies begin matching sets to clan names. Catalogues and authorities appear. The big point? Between roughly 1810 and 1860, the Victorian codified, labelled and marketed practices that many people now assume are medieval. Irony of ironies. What we call traditional Highland dress is largely 19th century fashion with a phenomenal PR team. Okay, forget costumes. If clans were sealed blood tribes, DNA should look like tidy islands. It doesn't. Historically, a clan wasn't a perfect family tree. It was a social, political and economic system. Chiefs held land. Tracksmen managed leases. Most people were tenants. If you lived on a chief's land, you were of the clan, in a legal and military sense, whether or not you shared his surname. Genetics backs this up. Scotland shows national structure, sure, but not sealed clan islands. Intermarriage, fosterage, adoption and migration were normal. Across the 16th and 17th centuries, clans behaved like federations and networks. Allegiances shifted with politics and economics more than with pure kinship. Archaeology and landscape history tell the same story on the ground. Head dikes, townships, estate boundaries, power and farming, not genetic fences. And the fighting? Real, but concentrated in particular periods, especially the 1500s and 1600s and Civil War era. Even in the Jacobite Rising, loyalty split, some clans Jacobite, some government. Yes. Absolutely. Clan societies, Highland games, family gatherings, museums, these are vibrant, living traditions. The key is understanding what they are. Modern clan identity is cultural heritage, not a biological tribe. The 19th century revival romanticised the past, but over 2 centuries, people made those revival practices their own. Traditions can be invented and still become meaningful. Verdict? Fiction. That most ancient clan traditions are truly ancient. The 1810s to 1860s built much of what we now treat as timeless. Scots pageantry, a royal Highland craze, and the first broad matching of tartan to specific clans. Fact. The historical clan was a flexible feudal system of land, loyalty and rent. People moved in and out. Names changed, marriages crossed supposed boundaries, the documents and the DNA agree. Your Scottish pride is real. The stories we tell about it just need better footnotes. Understanding how those traditions were created doesn't make them shallow. It makes them knowable. And that makes your choice about heritage more powerful. Speaking of myth versus reality, next time we're heading into rebellion. Not Culloden, the earlier rising that could have changed everything. The year? 1715. Subscribe so you don't miss why the 15 was more dangerous than you think. Most people, when they hear the Jacobite Rebellion, picture one date, 1745. Bonnie Prince Charlie, Tartan, romance, Culloden. Maybe a bit of Outlanders thrown in for good measure. But here's the thing. The most strategically dangerous Jacobite Rising wasn't 1745 at all. It was a rebellion 30 years earlier that almost no one talks about. In 1715, Jacobites didn't just march from the Highlands and hope for a miracle. They had serious support inside England, real interest from major European powers, and a British political system on the verge of tearing itself apart. Today, we're going to dig into the Jacobite Rising of 1715, the rebellion that was more threatening than 1745, but somehow lost the PR war. Let's forge the truth. So why does 1745 completely dominate the story? That's the rebellion we know. Bonnie Prince Charlie landing in the Highlands, the dramatic march south into England, the crushing defeat at Culloden in 1746, and then the brutal crackdown and later on the Highland Clearances, that all get bundled together as the emotional aftermath. It's perfect for romantic storytelling. Brave Highlanders in Tartan facing redcoats on an open moor. You can put it on shortbread tins, on pub signs, in novels and TV dramas. And historians, tour guides and pop culture often package it like this. The last great Jacobite rebellion, Scotland's final doomed bid for freedom. It's a neat arc. It makes for a tragic national myth. But that story hides three big problems. First, 1745 wasn't the first serious Jacobite attempt. It was the last in a series. Second, Jacobites weren't just scrappy Highlanders. They had real support in England and on the continent. And third, and this is the big one, if you want to see the moment the Hanoverian dynasty nearly died in its cradle, you don't look at 1745. You look at 1715. So let's rewind 30 years. First, what was actually happening in 1715? Just a year earlier, in 1714, Queen Anne had died without surviving heirs. After a lot of panicking and paperwork, the crown went to George, Elector of Hanover. A German prince who barely spoke English and had never set foot in Britain, so overnight you've got a brand new Hanoverian dynasty, a king many people saw as a foreigner, and a whole chunk of the political class who thought the throne should have gone to the Stuarts instead. That's the Jacobite pitch. James Edward Stuart, James III and VIII to his supporters as the rightful king. The Hanoverians are usurpers. Now here's what makes 1715 so explosive. Number one, serious English Tory support. Just before George I arrived, Tories had been running the government. After he took the throne, he sacked them and stacked power with the Whigs. Many Tories weren't just annoyed, they were furious. Some were quietly, and some not so quietly, sympathetic to the Jacobite cause. So this isn't just Highland chiefs grumbling in the glens. In 1715, you have genuine support among influential English politicians and landowners who see the Stuarts as a way to claw back power. Number two, international backing looked plausible. On the continent, the War of the Spanish Succession had just ended in 1713. Britain's old enemies France and Spain suddenly had spare ships, spare soldiers, and a big interest in destabilising their recent rival. French and Jacobite agents had already spent years exploring invasion plans. There had even been a serious French attempt to land a Jacobite force in Scotland in 1708. By 1715, the expectation among many Jacobites was clear. If we rise, foreign help will follow. And for a while, that looked believable. Spanish resources would become even more relevant a few years later in 1719 Rising. But the 1715 moment sits right in that window, where international support still seems like a real prospect, not just wishful thinking. Number 3, Scotland wasn't a hopeless backwater. There's another myth here, that early 18th century Scotland was just poor Highland crofts and not much else. In reality, by 1715, Scotland, especially the lowlands and the northeast, was already plugged into European trade, with growing towns like Glasgow and Aberdeen, active ports and ambitious merchants. Economic grievances after the Act of Union were real, but they existed alongside genuine opportunities and development. That matters, because it meant the Jacobite side wasn't operating from a completely under-resourced, isolated society. There were men, money and networks to tap into. So when John Erskine, Earl of Mar, raised the Stuart standard at Braemar in September 1715, he wasn't just waving a flag and hoping for the best. He quickly gathered thousands of men, and within weeks, Jacobites controlled most of the Highlands and large parts of northeast Scotland. This was not a romantic gesture, it was a very real attempt to overturn the government of Great Britain. Turns out, you need more than just angry Highlanders. In 1715, for a moment, they actually had more. But here's the twist. If you only look at the battles, Sheriffmuir, Preston, you miss why 1715 really terrified the people in charge. Because the most important battlefield wasn't just the moors of Scotland, it was Westminster. To understand why 1715 scared the Hanoverian regime so much, we need to zoom in on English politics. After 1714, politics is dominated by a ferocious split. On one side, the Whigs, strongly backing the Hanoverian succession, pro-parliament, pro-war with France, and broadly happy with the new financial system, the Bank of England, the national debt, all of that. On the other side, the Tories, more traditional, more royalist, more Church of England, deeply suspicious of standing armies and high taxes, and increasingly sidelined from power. When George I takes the throne, he overwhelmingly favours the Whigs. Many leading Tories either lose office, lose influence, or find themselves under suspicion of Jacobite sympathies. Some of those suspicions were completely justified. There were Tory Jacobites conspiring with James Edward Stuart's agents, seeing a Stuart restoration as their route back into power. So when Mar rises in Scotland in 1715, it's not just a regional rebellion. It's a crisis that could split the political elite, spark an English rising to match the Scottish one, and invite a foreign power to land troops while the government is distracted. You can see why Whig writers later talk about Whig supremacy, beginning with the defeat of the 1715 Rising. Once they survived that scare, they purged Tories from major positions and tightened their control. That only makes sense if 1715 genuinely looked like it could tip the whole system over. Now, what actually happens on the ground? In Scotland, Mar marches his army to Sheriffmuir in November 1715. The government commander, the Duke of Argyll, has fewer troops, but they're better trained. The battle itself is messy and indecisive. One Jacobite wing breaks the government line, another collapses. Both sides claim victory. Neither side can really follow up. Historians describe it as a missed opportunity that doomed the Rising. At almost the same time in England, Jacobite forces in the north, a mix of English gentry and Scottish Highlanders, are trapped in the town of Preston. After a brutal street-by-street fight, they are forced to surrender. So tactically, 1715 looks like a rebellion that fizzled. An indecisive battle in Scotland, a capitulation in England, and the so-called Old Pretender arriving too late to rescue anything. But politically, the government reacts like they've just had a near-death experience. After the Rising collapse, the Whigs tighten their grip on power. Tories are shut out of many offices for decades. Laws are passed to weaken potential Jacobite power bases and strengthen central authority. In other words, 1715 doesn't just fail, it reshapes British politics. And it does that because, for a few months, there was a very real fear that a foreign-backed Stuart monarch might land, large parts of England and Scotland might defect, and the Hanoverian dynasty might end before it properly began. You can't say that about 1745 in quite the same way. At this point, some of you are probably thinking, OK, but 1745 felt more dangerous. The Jacobites got as far as Derby in England, and Culloden leads straight into all that stuff about Highland culture being crushed. Totally fair. So let's compare. In 1745, Charles Edward Stuart lands in the Highlands with a tiny force. He wins some stunning victories, most famously at Preston Pans, and advances into England. But English support is far weaker than he hoped. There's no massive Tory uprising waiting to join him. Foreign backing from France is limited, there's some money, some troops, and planned invasions that never really comes off. Britain's enemies are busy with the War of the Austrian Succession. They're not going all in on the Stuarts this time. And crucially, in 1745, the Hanoverian system has had 3 decades to bed in. Whigs are entrenched in government, the financial system is stronger, London's ruling class is mostly not interested in gambling everything on a Stuart return. So yes, militarily, the march to Derby is dramatic, but politically, 1745 is a last desperate throw of the dice. 1715 is a rebellion happening when the whole system is still fragile. Then there's an independence question. We often hear the Jacobites were fighting for Scottish independence. That's not quite right. The core Jacobite goal was to restore the Stuart monarchy over all 3 kingdoms, Scotland, England and Ireland. Their claimant called himself not just James VIII of Scotland, but James III of England. Now, lots of Scottish Jacobites were also anti-union. They hated the 1707 Union settlement and wanted to rip it up. But that's not the same thing as fighting for a modern national idea of an independent Scotland. 1715 is especially interesting here, because it happens at a time when the economic benefits of union are still very much up for debate. Some Scots see new trading opportunities, others feel utterly betrayed. Economic anxieties and resentment absolutely feed into support for the Rising. By the time you get to 1745, more lowland elites have something to lose from blowing up the Union: trade, finance, social status. That's one reason the 1745 rebellion doesn't trigger the same level of broad cross-kingdom crisis as 1715. So, 1745 matters hugely for its aftermath: Culloden, repression, the transformation of Highland society. But 1715 is where the political system itself is wobbling on the edge. Let's answer the big question. Was the 1715 Jacobite Rising actually more strategically significant than the famous 1745 rebellion? Looking at the evidence, 1715 takes place at the moment of maximum vulnerability for the new Hanoverian regime, right after a disputed succession and a bitterly divided political class. It has real, if muddled, support among English Tories, not just Scottish clans. It sits in a European context where Britain's enemies, fresh from a massive continental war, are both the motive and potentially the means to intervene. Jacobites in 1715 managed to control much of northern Scotland for months, raising a substantial army and forcing the government to divert serious forces north. And when it fails, the political shockwave is huge. Decades of Whig dominance, Tory exclusion, and a British state that reorganises itself very consciously against the Jacobite threat. By contrast, 1745 begins with a tiny force and relies heavily on momentum and myth. It does create real alarm, no question. but it never has the same depth of English elite support, or the same realistic prospect of a full-scale foreign invasion behind it. So verdict time. If you're talking about raw strategic danger to the British state, the 1715 Jacobite Rising was at least as serious as 1745, and arguably more so. But 1715 is the one that shaped British politics. It's the rebellion that helped lock in decades of Whig supremacy, pushed Tories to the margins, and turned Jacobitism from a live political alternative into eventually a romantic lost cause. The rebellion nobody talks about may be one of the reasons modern Britain looks the way it does. And we're not done with Scotland's hidden history yet, because if you think the Jacobites are Scotland's only military story, wait till you meet the secret weapons that changed medieval warfare. In the next episode, we're going to look into the tactics, technology, and downright sneaky tricks that let a supposedly small, poor kingdom punch way above its weight on the battlefield. So if you want to see how Scotland outthought its enemies long before the Jacobites, hit subscribe, drop a comment with the Jacobite myth you grew up hearing, and I'll see you in the next one. Let's keep forging the truth. How did tiny medieval Scotland keep beating back the mighty English war machine? We're told it was all heart. Brave underdogs, heroic charges, doomed blast stands. But when you look at the actual campaigns, a different pattern appears. Time and again, Scottish commanders turned English strengths into weaknesses, with tactics England simply couldn't copy. By the end of this episode, you'll see that Scotland's real secret weapon wasn't a single battlefield trick. It was a whole way of fighting a stronger enemy on your own terms. We love this story, right? Brave Scots wode on their faces enormous swords, standing in a muddy field, wildly outnumbered, somehow snatching victory from the jaws of certain death. Films like Braveheart and a lot of later romantic history lean hard into that David versus Goliath narrative. England as this organised, disciplined, armoured juggernaut, and Scotland as a bunch of half-naked lunatics who win through sheer rage and patriotism. It's a brilliant story. It's just not the full story. Because when you zoom out and look at the wars of independence and the campaigns that followed, you see something else. Scots choosing when and where to fight, English armies bogged down, starved and ambushed, cavalry charges that should have wiped out Scottish infantry, simply breaking and dying on walls of spears. So in this episode, we're going to ask, what did Scotland actually do differently? What could Scotland do that England couldn't copy? And were Scottish victories really lucky breaks, or the result of a very deliberate playbook? Let's start with the most famous Scottish secret weapon. And it wasn't a sword, it was a formation, the Schiltron. Imagine a dense block of infantry packed shoulder to shoulder, all holding long spears or pikes angled outwards. A hedgehog of steel. These formations were specifically designed to stop what medieval commanders relied on most, the heavy cavalry charge. Early versions of the Schiltron were used at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298. The Scots formed static spear circles that could, in theory, resist cavalry. But they were vulnerable to English longbow fire and were eventually broken. So here's the key. The Scots adapted. By the time of Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce had turned the Schiltron from a static, please don't trample us formation into an offensive weapon. He drilled his men so those pike blocks could move in formation, advancing as a solid wall of spear points. This was a genuine tactical innovation. The English plan at Bannockburn relied on their armoured knights smashing relatively light infantry. Instead, they galloped into prepared ground, pits and obstacles, and then straight into tightly drilled schiltrons that refuse to break. We often hear that 3,000 Scots beat 15,000 English at Bannockburn. The numbers are debated, but what's not debated is the outcome. English cavalry were mauled. Contemporary and modern analysis agree that poorly supported heavy cavalry is extremely vulnerable to dense spear formations on the right terrain. And that's the other part of the Scottish advantage: terrain selection. At Stirling Bridge, the Scots forced a larger English army to cross a narrow bridge, attacking as they emerged and preventing them from deploying properly. At Bannockburn, Bruce chose ground that restricted cavalry with marshes and pits, funneling the English into kill zones. This is not primitive warfare. This is understanding how your enemy expects to win. Designing a formation that flips that strength into a weakness, training your men hard enough that they can hold that formation under absolute terror. Or to put it in modern terms, if you're bringing thousands of expensive war horses to a fight and the other guy has invented anti-horse mode, you're in trouble. So myth number 1. The myth: Scottish victories were just lucky breaks. Reality: the schiltron used on carefully chosen terrain systematically neutralised the English cavalry advantage. And once you do that, the mighty English army suddenly looks a lot less invincible. But schiltrons weren't Scotland's only trick. Even the best pike square isn't going to help you if the enemy can starve you, surround you, and hit you from two sides at once. That's where Scotland's other secret weapon comes in: a different style of warfare in the Highlands and borders, and an alliance that meant England was almost never fighting on just one front. Let's zoom out from the battlefield to the map of Europe. In 1295, Scotland signed what became known as the Old Alliance with France, a military and diplomatic pact aimed squarely at their shared problem: England. This is often treated as a nice bit of romantic history, good for rugby trophies and wine imports. But militarily, it was a nightmare for the English planners. Here's why it mattered. 1. Two-front pressure. If England attacked Scotland, France could attack English holdings in France. If England went all in against France, Scotland could raid across the northern border. That meant English kings were constantly worried about being stretched too thin. They couldn't just throw everything at Scotland and hope for a quick, crushing victory, because doing that might open the door for a French offensive in Europe. Even when French armies weren't literally marching alongside Scots, the threat of the coordination forced England to divide attention, resources and troops. 2. Flow of tactics, troops and tech. The alliance wasn't just on paper. Over the later Middle Ages, thousands of Scots fought in France and French commanders and knights fought in Scotland. Scottish troops served in French armies and even in the personal guard of the French kings. That kind of contact matters. Scottish commanders saw firsthand how major continental powers fought. They brought back experience in siegecraft, fortifications and combined arms. Scottish nobles and mercenaries gained access to continental equipment and training. Again, we're not saying Scotland had better tech than England overall. England was a wealthy kingdom with strong armourers and fleets. But through this alliance, Scotland plugged itself into a wider European military network, instead of being isolated on a rainy rock in the North Atlantic. 3. Economic and psychological warfare. The alliance also amplified something the Scots were already good at: economic warfare. Rather than always standing in front of English armies in open battle, Scottish leaders, especially Robert the Bruce, repeatedly used scorched earth tactics and raids to make invasions expensive and unsustainable. Bruce and his commanders emptied and burned areas the English were about to march through, removed livestock and grains so invading armies had nothing to eat, hit garrisons, foraging parties and supply convoys in quick raids, then vanished into difficult terrain. Now add the Old Alliance to that picture. England is pouring money into campaigns in France. At the same time, Scottish raids are burning manors and crops in the north of England. Every lost wagon, every burnt harvest is money and manpower England can't use elsewhere.
One modern historian summary of Bruce is basically master of guerrilla warfare. He won not by chasing glory in big open battles, but by making English rule in Scotland unworkably expensive until they had to cut their losses. So myth number 2. Myth: Scots were always outnumbered and outgunned. Reality: through the old alliance and economic warfare, Scotland turned its weakness into a strategic trap that drained English resources across 2 fronts. England had more men, more money, and more metal. Scotland's advantage was making sure that never mattered as much as it should have. Now let's tackle a couple of related myths at once. Highland warfare was primitive. The English always had superior military technology. Highland warfare looks primitive if you judge it by French fields and tournament rules. It makes a lot more sense when you realise how much of Scotland is mountains, bogs, glens and narrow passes. Highland light infantry and guerrilla tactics. In that environment, heavy armoured knights and tight-packed missile lines are not king. What is king? Fast-moving light infantry, men who know every hill path and ford. The ability to vanish into the landscape and reappear somewhere very inconvenient. Highland and Isles warriors specialised in ambushes, hitting columns as they stretched out along narrow routes. Night raids, smashing camps, burning supplies, stealing livestock. Hit and run attacks, inflicting casualties and then melting back into ground that heavy troops struggled to cross. These were highly specialised tactics for that terrain, not a lack of sophistication. They're exactly what modern militaries would call irregular or guerrilla warfare, and Bruce used them for years to grind down English control even when he couldn't risk a big set-piece battle. The Scottish bow question: what about technology, especially the famous longbow? It's true, the English and Welsh longbow, deployed in large disciplined units, was one of the most effective weapon systems in medieval Europe. It contributed heavily to English victories not just in France, but also over Scottish armies at battles like Falkirk and Halidon Hill. So does that mean Scots were miles behind? Not really. Archaeology and records suggest that throughout Britain, including Scotland, people used powerful hunting and war bows. The difference was mainly how many trained archers you could field and how you used them. Scots did deploy archers, often from the Highlands and Isles, and in combination with spearmen and light cavalry, at Bannockburn for example, Scottish archers helped harass and disrupt English formations once their cavalry was blunted by schiltrons and bad ground. So the reality is, England had a more systematic archery programme and could field huge bodies of longbowmen. Scotland used bows more selectively as part of combined arms tactics, supporting schiltrons, raids and pursuits. In other words, the Scots weren't technologically incapable, they just couldn't match England arrow for arrow. So they leaned harder into the tactics and terrain where English longbows mattered less. Combined arms Scottish style meant schiltron infantry holding the line and breaking cavalry, light infantry and Highlanders raiding, screening and harassing, archers hitting exposed or disordered enemy troops, light cavalry used for scouting, flanking and pursuit, not suicidal front-on charges. Again, not primitive, just optimised for Scottish problems, not French plains. So myth number 3, myth. Highland warfare was primitive and England always had superior tech. Reality, Highland tactics were specialised for brutal terrain, and Scottish forces combined infantry, archers and cavalry in ways that often sidestepped England's biggest advantages. At this point, someone always says, OK, fine, Scotland had some clever tricks, but England eventually conquered Scotland. So how secret or successful were these weapons really? Good question, and the answer actually helps prove the point. First, we have to separate 2 very different things: military defeat on the battlefield, political union and dynastic change. Through the late 13th and 14th centuries, despite multiple invasions, massacres, sieges and crushing defeats, Scotland remained an independent kingdom. The first wars of independence end with a Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328, formally recognising Scotland's independence with Robert the Bruce as king. That's not what you'd expect if English military power was simply overwhelming and Scottish tactics were lucky chaos. Later on, the Union of Crowns in 1603, when James VI of Scotland also became James I of England, wasn't the result of some epic English victory over Scottish armies. It was a dynastic accident. The Tudor line in England ran out of direct heirs, and the next legitimate monarch happens to be the King of Scotland. Then the Act of Union in 1707 was primarily a political and economical deal hammered out between elites, not the result of English armies finally working out how to beat Scottish tactics. There were military pressures in the background, sure, but no Bannockburn in reverse where Scotland's army is decisively wiped off the map. Meanwhile, many of the methods that worked so well for Scots, flexible infantry formations, terrain exploitation, economic warfare, became part of the wider British military toolbox later on. So myth number 4. Myth: England's eventual political union with Scotland proved Scottish military methods were inferior. Reality: Scotland maintained independence for centuries because of those methods, and union came through dynasties and diplomacy, not a final crushing military defeat. If anything, England learned from Scotland that raw power isn't everything in war. So, did Scotland really have a secret weapon against England? Not one, several. Shiltron pike formations, drilled to move and hold on chosen ground that could turn elite cavalry into very expensive casualties. Highland light infantry and guerrilla tactics, perfectly adapted to brutal terrain and chewed up heavy forces. Economic warfare, scorched earth cattle raids and supply line attacks that made holding Scotland ruinously costly. Combined arms, infantry, archers and light cavalry working together to exploit English mistakes. And the Old Alliance, tying England into a two-front problem it could never fully solve. So, verdict. It's fact. Scotland developed systematic military advantages that often neutralised England's superior numbers and resources. Scottish victories weren't just luck. They were the result of deliberate innovation, ruthless adaptation, and a deep understanding of how to fight a stronger enemy on your own ground. And yet, for all that tactical brilliance, Scotland's greatest wound didn't come from a battlefield at all. In the next episode, we're leaving the spear walls and cavalry charges behind and going to the accounting books. We'll look at how an economic decision, not a military defeat, helped set the stage for one of Scotland's greatest tragedies, the Highland Clearances. If you want to follow that story and the rest of Scotland Uncovered, feel free to subscribe and stick around, because the myths about Scotland don't stop on the battlefield. Thanks for watching. Most people think they know this story. The Highland Clearances. Whole communities burned out of their homes. Gaelic culture crushed. The Highlands emptied so sheep could take their place. So here's the blunt question. Were the Highland Clearances a form of genocide or cold-blooded economic modernisation? You'll hear people say English landlords destroyed Scottish culture on purpose, that it was a deliberate attempt to wipe the Highlanders off the map. But when you actually look at the population, the emigration records, and the money involved, a different picture starts to appear. By the end of this episode, you'll see why the truth is more complicated than either simple story. It wasn't a heroic last stand, and it wasn't an organised genocide either. It was something messier, and in some ways, even more uncomfortable. Stay with me. Let's start with the story most of us have grown up with. In the popular version, the Highland Clearances look like a deliberate campaign of destruction. You've got ruthless, often English or anglicised landlords sneering at their Gaelic tenants. They decide the people are useless and systematically drive them off the land, burning homes, smashing communities, and deliberately destroying Highland culture. In this narrative, every clearance is violent. Cottages set on fire, soldiers dragging families out, old people dying by the roadside, ships crammed with exiles sent across the ocean never to return. TV dramas, novels, and tourist myths lean hard into this. The Highlands become a tragic victim of intentional cultural extermination. You'll even hear phrases like ethnic cleansing or genocide of the Gaels thrown around. And you can see why that sticks. It's emotionally powerful. It makes sense of real trauma, families torn from land they'd farmed for generations, a language pushed to the margins, and empty glens where there used to be smoke rising from hundreds of hearths. It also fits a simple good versus evil story. Villains, greedy landlords often labelled English or lowland elites. Victims, noble Highlanders, loyal, brave, and wronged. Motive, pure hatred of a people and their culture. The problem is, that story is compelling, but it's incomplete, and in some ways, misleading. To see what really happened, we need to do something very un-YouTube. Talk about profit, population, and property law. First big question. If this was a genocide, what was the motive supposed to be? Because when you look at what actually happened to the land after people were cleared, one thing stands out. The glens weren't left empty as some kind of dead zone. They were reorganised and turned into large sheep farms. From the late 18th century into the 19th, the Highlands were pulled into a wider shift in agricultural happening across Britain and much of Europe. Small subsistence plots were being consolidated. Land was being run for profit, not just survival. Landlords were under pressure to turn estates into businesses, not just status symbols. In the Highlands, that new business model meant sheep. Sheep produced wool for export. They needed far fewer workers than scattered tenant families. And on paper, they brought in far more money than traditional low-rent, small-scale farming. So instead of hundreds of families paying modest rents and scraping by, you could have a handful of shepherds, a big flock, and a steady income from wool. That doesn't make landlords sympathetic. Many were still ruthless, out of touch, or just plain cruel. But their main motive looks far more like economic calculation than ethnic hatred. Then there's the population question. If it was genocide in the strict sense, an attempt to wipe out a people, you'd expect to see the Highland population collapse and never recover. Instead, what you see is more complicated. Some areas lose people dramatically, especially inland glens and some islands. Other areas, especially coastal strips and new crofting communities, actually end up more crowded for a while, as people are shoved onto smaller, poorer plots. Overall, Highlanders don't simply vanish. The population shifts, but it doesn't just disappear overnight. So if this was meant to be a clean extermination of a people, it was bizarrely badly executed, and suspiciously good at turning land into money. In other words, it looks less like destroy the Highlanders because we hate them, and more like sheep are a better business model than people. But hold on, because when you follow where the people actually went, another twist appears. Yes, there were brutal evictions. Yes, some people were forced onto boats. But in the records, you also find assisted emigration schemes and families who, faced with a grim future on tiny scraps of land, actually chose to leave. So here's the paradox. If this was only about kicking people out, why do we see so many Highlanders taking the chance to go abroad? To answer that, we need to look at emigration and demographics. From the late 1700s into the 1800s, Scotland became one of the most emigration-heavy countries in Europe. Tens of thousands of people left over the clearance period. Many of them came from the Highlands. Some were pushed. Some felt they had no real choice. Others looked at their options and decided, a risky voyage overseas was still better than guaranteed poverty at home. Where did they go? To growing industrial towns in Central Belt, Glasgow, Dundee, Edinburgh, looking for work in factories, shipyards and docks. To North America, especially Canada, to Australia and New Zealand as new colonies opened up land and opportunities. In many cases, landlords actively encouraged this, paying towards passage on the condition that tenants didn't come back. Now, assisted emigration sounds softer than it really was. In reality, the choice for many families looked like stay in the Highlands on a tiny, exhausted patch of land that can barely grow anything, or accept a one-way ticket to a place you've never seen. Is that truly voluntary? Morally, it's murky as hell, but it shows this wasn't always soldiers at the door or nothing. There's another factor too, potato blight. In the 1840s, the potato crop failed in parts of the Highlands, just as it did in Ireland. That hit communities who were already living on the edge, often pushed onto poorer land by earlier clearances. But the overall outcome was different from Ireland's catastrophe. Scotland still saw hunger, hardship, and deaths, but instead of mass death on an Irish scale, the main solution became movement. Most people left for towns or emigrated. Some relief came in, patchy and often too late. The crisis accelerated changes that was already underway. So what you end up with is less are people starved into extinction and more are people pushed outwards into cities and across the world. Over the long term, some Highland districts do empty out or decline sharply. Others linger on with ageing, shrinking populations. But Highlanders don't stop existing. They show up again as workers in Glasgow and other Scottish towns, settlers and soldiers in Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand. Part of big diaspora communities that still talk about the Highlands generations later. So demographically, this isn't a clean story of extermination, it's a story of displacement and dispersal. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, Tam, so maybe it wasn't genocide in the technical sense, but people were still burned out of their homes. Does any of this economic and demographic stuff actually make it less brutal? No. And this is important. Explaining is not excusing. There were genuinely horrific episodes during the clearances. Roofs deliberately set on fire so people couldn't move back in. Whole townships emptied in a single day, the elderly and the sick left with nowhere else to go. People herded onto marginal land along the coasts where survival depends on fishing, kelp, or sheer luck. Even when removals were negotiated, the power balance was totally one-sided. The landlord held the legal title. The tenant had almost no formal protection. So yes, even if the main motive was profit rather than extermination, the human cost was enormous. Communities shattered, families split between continents, Gaelic language and culture weakened in its heartlands, even as parts of it survived in diaspora. That's one reason why some people reach for the word genocide today. They're trying to express just how devastating it was. But when you look at the pattern as a whole, you don't see a state or a ruling class drawing up a plan to physically wipe out Highlanders because of who they were. What you see is a ruling class chasing higher profits, a legal system that almost entirely favoured property owners, a wider European trend of turning traditional rural societies into commercial agriculture. And Highlanders caught at the sharpest, most brutal end of that process. So the honest view is, it was tragic and unjust, but it sits in a different category from events that were openly designed as extermination. So where does that leave us? Let's go back to the original question. Were the Highland Clearances genocide or economics? Based on the evidence, the best answer is complicated economic modernisation with a tragic human cost. When you step back, a few things become clear. The Highland population in some areas falls sharply. But the people, as a group, don't just vanish. They move, they migrate, they have children elsewhere. Large-scale sheep farming and commercial agriculture were more profitable than keeping lots of small tenants, and the profit motive drove most of the decisions. Immigration wasn't just people dragged in chains. Many left under intense pressure, but with assisted passage and hopes of a better life abroad. The whole process operated within a property system that overwhelmingly backed landlords, not tenants. Similar patterns of clearing land and consolidating farms appear in other parts of Britain and Europe. The Highlands were a particularly harsh example of a wider trend, not a freak event. At the same time, many evictions were harsh, rushed, and indifferent to human suffering. Entire communities were broken up, language and culture took massive hits, even if they didn't die completely. So if you came into this video thinking the clearances were straightforward genocide, the overall pattern doesn't really support that. But if you came in thinking it was just progress, nothing to see here, that's just as wrong. The reality is uglier and less satisfying. The Highland clearances were what happens when economic modernisation, legal power, and human lives collide. And the people at the bottom of the system don't get a say. So where does that leave us as modern Scots or descendants of Scots looking back? I'd argue it leaves us with a double responsibility. First, to recognise how much pain, loss and dislocation the clearances caused. Second, to understand the evidence well enough not to flatten that story into an easy slogan. If you've made it this far in the Scotland Uncover series, thank you. But we're not done with Scotland's messy past yet. For a potential season 2, we've got some big questions on the table. How much Viking is really in Scottish DNA culture? Who were the medieval Scottish queens? History quietly pushed to the side. And what's the truth behind the real Macbeth? King, tyrant, or victim of Shakespeare's PR machine? Let me know in the comments which mystery you want us to tackle next. If this helped you see the clearances differently, hit like so YouTube actually shows it to someone else. I'm Tam, this is Fact or Fiction Foundry, and as always, let's keep forging the truth.